Hello, everybody. My name is Stone, and welcome back to Halo Contact Harvest. We are on Chapter 2. Let's begin. Earth, Greater Chicago Industrial Zone, August 10th, 2524. When Avery woke, he was already home. Chicago, the one-time heart of the American Midwest, was now an urban sprawl that covered the former states of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. The territory wasn't part of the United States, not in any formal sense. Some people who lived in the zone still considered themselves American, but like everyone else on the planet, they were citizens of the United Nations, a sea change in governance that was inevitable once humanity began to colonize other worlds. First Mars, then the Jovian moons, and then planets in other systems. Checking his comm pad on the military shuttle from orbit to the Great Lakes spaceport, Avery confirmed he was on a 2-week pass, that he'd be able to enjoy his first extended break from Operation Trebuchet. There was a note on the pass from Avery's CEO detailing the injuries sustained by the Marines on his last mission. All of Avery's Alpha Squad had survived with minor injuries, but Bravo Squad hadn't been so lucky. 3 Marines were killed in action, KIA, and Staff Sergeant Byrne was hanging by a thread in a UNSC hospital ship. The note said nothing about civilian casualties, but Avery remembered the force of the hauler's blast, and he doubted any had survived. He tried not to think, let his mind go blank as he boarded a maglev passenger train from the spaceport to the zone. Only later, when Avery stepped out onto the elevated platform of the Cottage Grove terminal, did the hot and humid air of a late Chicago summer snap his senses back into focus. As the sun dove to a fiery finish, he enjoyed what little breeze was coming off Lake Michigan, lukewarm gusts that hammered up the east-west blocks of tumbled-down gray stone apartments, scattering the autumn leaves of the sidewalk maples. Arms laden with duffel bags, and wearing his navy blue dress pants and collared shirt and cap, Avery was drenched with sweat by the time he reached the Seropian, a center for active retirement, or so its hospitality computer told him. As he stepped into the tower's stifling lobby, Avery's aunt Marcille had moved to the complex. Avery's Aunt Marcille had moved to the complex a few years after he'd joined the Marines, vacating the same walk-up apartment on Blackstone Avenue they'd shared since Avery was a boy. His aunt's health was failing, and she'd needed extra care. And more to the point, she was lonely without him. As Avery waited for an elevator that would take him up to the 37th floor, he stared into a recreation room filled with many of the Seropians' bald and silver-haired residents. Most were clustered around a video display tuned to one of the public comm's all-news channels. There was a report of fresh INI attacks in Epsilon Eridanus, a series of bombings that had killed thousands of civilians. As usual, the broadcast featured a UNSC spokesperson who flatly denied the military's campaign was faltering. But Avery knew the facts. The insurrection had already claimed more than 1 million lives. The INI attacks were becoming more effective, and the UNSC reprisals were heavy-handed. It was an ugly civil war that wasn't getting any prettier. One of the residents in the rec room, a black man with a deeply lined face and a crown of wiry gray hair, spotted Avery and frowned. He whispered something to a large white woman in a voluminous house dress, overflowing a wheelchair by his side. Soon, all the residents that weren't hard of hearing or too dim-sighted to see Avery's uniform were nodding and clucking, some with respect, others with scorn. Avery had almost changed into his civilian clothes on the shuttle to avoid just this sort of uncomfortable reaction. But in the end, he decided to stick with the dress blues for his aunt's sake. She'd waited a long time to see her nephew come home, all spit and polish. The elevator was even warmer than the lobby, but inside his aunt's apartment, the air was so frigid Avery could see his breath. "Auntie?" he called, dropping his duffels on the well-worn blue carpet of her living room. The bottles of fine bourbon he'd bought at the spaceport duty-free clinked together between his neatly folded fatigues. He didn't know if his aunt's doctors were letting her drink, but he did know how much she used to enjoy an occasional mint julep. "Where are you?" But there was no reply. The flower-patterned walls of the living room were covered with picture frames. Some very old, faded prints of long-dead relatives his aunt used to talk about as if she'd known them personally. Most of the frames held hollow stills, three-dimensional pictures from his aunt's lifetime. He saw his favorite, the one of his teenage aunt standing on the shore of Lake Michigan in a honeybee-striped bathing suit and wide straw hat. She was pouting at the camera and its cameraman, Avery's uncle, who had passed away before he was born. But there was something wrong with the stills. They seemed oddly out of focus, and as Avery stepped down the narrow hallway to his aunt's bedroom and ran his fingers across the framed sheets of glass, he realized they were covered in a thin layer of ice. Avery rubbed his palm against a large hollow still near the bedroom door, and a young boy's face appeared beneath the frost. "Me," he grimaced, remembering the day his aunt had taken the still, my first day of church. Wiping downward, his mind filled with memories, the suffocating pinch of his white, freshly starched Oxford shirt, the smell of carnauba wax, liberally applied to mask the scuffs in his oversized wingtip shoes. Growing up, Avery's clothes were almost always worn-out hand-me-downs from distant cousins that were never quite big enough for his tall, broad-shouldered frame. "Just as they should be," his aunt said, smiling, holding up new pieces of his wardrobe for inspection. "A boy isn't a boy that doesn't ruin his clothes." But her painstaking patching and sewing had always ensured Avery looked his best, especially for church. "Now don't you look handsome," his aunt had cooed the day she'd taken the frozen still. Then, as she'd done up his little paisley tie, "So much like your mother, so much like your father." According to assessments of an inheritance Avery hadn't understood, there had been no pictures of his parents in his aunt's old house, and there were none in her apartment now, although she'd never once said anything unkind about them. These bittersweet comparisons had been her only praise. "Auntie, you in there?" Avery asked, knocking softly on her bedroom door. Again, there was no answer. He remembered the sound of raised voices behind other closed doors, the angry end of his parents' marriage. His father had left his mother so distraught that she could no longer care for herself, let alone an active 6-year-old boy. He took one last look at the hollow still, argyle socks beneath neatly cuffed tan slacks, an unabashed smile, no less sincere for his aunt's prompting. Then he opened her bedroom door. If the living room had felt like a refrigerator, the bedroom was a freezer. Avery's heart dropped into his stomach. But it wasn't until he saw the line of 16 evenly spaced cigarettes, one for each hour of her waking day, untouched on a bedside vanity, that Avery knew for sure his aunt was dead. He stared at her body, stiff as a board under the layers of crocheted and quilted blankets, as the sweat on the back of his neck froze solid. Then he stepped to the foot of the bed and lowered himself into a threadbare armchair where he remained, spine set against the cold, for almost an hour, until someone keyed the apartment door. "She's in here," muttered one of the complex's orderlies as he tramped down the hallway. A young man with a sunken chin and shoulder-length blonde hair peered into the bedroom. "Jesus!" He jumped back, catching sight of Avery. "Who are you?" "How many days?" Avery asked. "What? How many days has she been lying here?" "Listen, unless I know, I'm her nephew," Avery growled, his eyes locked on the bed. "How many days?" The orderly swallowed. 3. Then, in a nervous torrent, Look, it's been busy, and she didn't have any. I mean, we didn't know she had any relatives in system. The apartment is on automatic. It dropped to freezing the moment she. The orderly trailed off as Avery stared him down. Take her away, Avery said flatly. The orderly motioned to his shorter, plumper partner cowering in the hallway behind him. Quickly, the two men positioned their stretcher beside the bed, peeled back the layers of bedding, and gently transferred the body. Records say she was evangelical promesic. Promesic? The orderly fumbled with the stretcher straps. Is that right? But Avery's gaze had returned to the bed, and he didn't reply. His aunt was so frail that her body left only the barest impression in the foam mattress. She was a small woman, but Avery remembered how tall and strong she'd looked when Zone Social Services had dropped him off on her doorstep. A mountain of surrogate maternal love and discipline in his wary 6-year-old eyes. What's your comm address? The thin orderly continued. I'll let you know the name of the processing center. Avery drew his hand out of his pockets and laid them on his lap. The squat orderly noticed Avery's fingers tighten into a fist and coughed, a signal to his partner that now would be a good time to leave. The two men worked the stretcher back and forth until it pointed out of the bedroom, then bumped it noisily down the hallway and out of the apartment door. Avery's hand shook. His aunt had been teetering on the edge for some time, but in their recent comm correspondence, she'd told him not to worry. Hearing that, he'd wanted to take his leave immediately, but his CEO had ordered him to lead one more mission. A whole hell of a lot of good it did anyone, Avery cursed. While his aunt lay dying, he was strapped to a Hornet, circling the Jim Dandy back on tribute. Avery leapt from the chair, stepped quickly to his duffels, and pulled out one of the fifths of bourbon from the duty-free. He grabbed his navy dress coat and stuffed the glass flask into an interior pocket. A moment later, he was out of the apartment door. Dog and pony, Avery asked the hospitality computer on the way down to the lobby. Is it still in business? Open daily until 4 a.m., the computer replied through a small speaker in the elevator's floor selection pad. Ladies pay no cover. Shall I call a cab? I'll walk. Avery twisted the cap off the bottle and took a generous swig. Then he added to himself, while I still can. The bottle only lasted an hour, but others were easy to find, as one night of drinking became 2, then 3. Gut check, rebound, severe tire damage. Names of clubs filled with civilians eager for Avery's money, but not the slurred stories of how he'd earned it. Except for a girl on a low-lit stage in a dive off Halsted Street. The pretty redhead was so good at pretending to listen, Avery didn't mind pretending it had nothing to do with how often he'd tapped his credit chip against the jeweled reader in her navel. The money drew her freckled skin and smell and lazy smile closer, until a rough hand fell on Avery's shoulder. Watch your hands, soldier boy, a bouncer warned, his voice raised above the club's thumping music. Avery looked away from the girl, her back arched high above the stage. The bouncer was tall, with a substantial gut that his tight black turtleneck could barely contain. His strong arms were padded with a deceptive layer of fat. Avery shrugged. I've paid. Not to touch, the bouncer sneered, revealing 2 platinum incisors. This is a class establishment. Avery reached for a little round table between his knees and the stage. How much? He asked, raising his credit chip. 500. Screw you. Like I said, class. Already spent plenty, Avery muttered. His UNSC salary was modest, and most of that had gone to help with his aunt's apartment. Aw, now see? The bouncer jabbed a thumb at the girl. She was slowly sliding backward on stage, her smile now a worried frown. Gotta talk nice, soldier boy. The bouncer tightened his grip on Avery's shoulders. She's not one of those any sluts are used to out in Epsy. Avery was sick of the bouncer's hand. He was sick of being called boy, but having some civilian puke insult him, someone who had no idea what he had actually gotten used to on the front lines of the insurrection, that was the last straw. "Let me go," Avery growled. "We gonna have a problem?" "All depends on you." With his free hand, the bouncer reached behind his back and pulled a metal rod from his belt. "Why don't you and me step outside?" With a flick of his wrist, the rod doubled in length and revealed an electrified tip. It was a humbler stun device. Avery had seen Oni interrogators lay into any prisoners with the things. He knew how debilitating they were, and though Avery doubted the bouncer had as much skill with the humbler as an Oni spook, he had no intention of ending up jerking around in a puddle of his own piss on this class establishment's floor. Avery reached for his drink resting at the center of the table. "I'm good right here." "Listen, you jarhead son of a—" But Avery's reach was just a feint. As the bouncer leaned forward to follow, Avery grabbed the man's wrist and pulled it over his shoulder. Then he yanked down, breaking it at the elbow. The girl on the stage screamed as ragged bone tore through the bouncer's shirt, spattering blood on her face and hair. As the bouncer howled and dropped to his knees, two of his partners, similarly dressed and built, rushed forward, flinging chairs out of their way. Avery stood and turned to meet them, but he was drunker than he'd thought, and missed an opening blow to the bridge of his nose that snapped his head back and sent his own blood arcing toward the stage. Avery reeled back into the bouncer's crushing arms, but as they rushed him out of the club's back door, one of them slipped on the metal staircase leading to the alley. In that moment, Avery was able to twist free, give much better than he got, and stagger away from the noise of approaching sirens before a pair of blue and white sedans deposited four of the zone's finest on the club's doorstep. Stumbling along Halstead's crowded sidewalk, his dress uniform now as filthy as a set of battlefield fatigues, Avery fled from the paranoia of accusing glances to a dirty crawl space beneath a riveted riser for the local maglev line. A repurposed brace from Chicago's old elevated railway, still recognizable despite centuries of shoring. Avery stuffed a green plastic trash bag between himself and the riser and settled into a fitful stupor. Make me proud. Do what's right. This had been his aunt's instructions on the day of his enlistment. Her small but strong fingers reaching up to cup his 19-year-old chin. Become the man I know you can be. And Avery had tried. He'd left Earth ready to fight for her and those like her. Innocents whose lives the UNSC had convinced him were threatened by men inimical but otherwise identical to him. Killers, innies, the enemy. But where was the pride? And what had he become? Avery dreamed of a boy choking in the arms of a woman with a detonator, imagining the perfect shot that would have saved all in the restaurant and his fellow Marines. But deep down, he knew there was no perfect shot. No magic bullet that could stop the insurrection. Avery felt a chill that jerked him awake. But the near silent rumble of a maglev passenger train overhead had only shifted the bag of trash, setting Avery's back against the perspiring metal of the old brace. He leaned forward and put his head between his knees. "I'm sorry," Avery croaked, wishing his aunt were alive to hear it. Then his mind collapsed under the multiplicative weight of loss and guilt and rage. Lieutenant Downs slammed the door of his dark blue sedan with enough force to rock the low-swept vehicle on its four thick tires. He'd had the kid hooked, ready to enlist, but then the parents got wind of his efforts and the whole thing fell apart. If it weren't for Downs' uniform, the father might have taken a swing at him. Though he was no longer field fit, in his dress blues, the UNSC Marine Corps recruiter was still an imposing presence. As the lieutenant recorded his mental list of prospects, a small group of primarily young men who'd shown any interest in his cold calls and street corner pitches, he reminded himself it wasn't easy recruiting soldiers during wartime. With a war as brutal and unpopular as the insurrection, his job was damn near impossible. Not that his CEO cared. Downs' quota was 5 new Marines per month. With less than a week to go, he hadn't landed even one. "You gotta be kidding me," the lieutenant grimaced as he rounded the back of his sedan. Someone had used a can of red spray paint to scrawl "Innies out" on the vehicle's thick bumper. Downs smoothed his close-cropped hair. It was an increasingly popular slogan, a rallying cry for the more liberal core world citizens who believed the best way to end the killing in Epsilon Eridanus was simply to let the system go, have the military pull out, and give the insurrectionists the autonomy they desired. The lieutenant wasn't a politician, and while he doubted the UN leadership would have ever appeased the Annies, he knew a few things for sure. The war was still on. The Marine Corps was an all-volunteer force, and he had only a few days to fill his quota before someone with a lot more brass than him took another bite out of his already well-chewed ass. The lieutenant popped the sedan's trunk and removed his dress cap and briefcase. As the trunk closed automatically behind him, he strode toward the recruitment center, a converted storefront in a strip mall on Chicago's old near north side. As Downs neared the door, he noticed a man slumped against it. 48789-20114, AJ, Avery mumbled. Say again? Downs asked. He knew a UNSC serial number when he heard it, but the lieutenant still hadn't quite accepted the drunk outside his office was a Marine Corps staff sergeant, indicated by the 4 gold chevrons on his filthy dress coat sleeve. It's valid, Avery said, raising his head from his chest. Check it. The lieutenant straightened his shoulders. He wasn't used to taking orders from a non-commissioned officer. Avery belched. I'm AWOL. 72 hours. That got Downs' attention. He cracked his briefcase in the crook of his elbow and withdrew his compad. Give me that one more time, he asked, inputting Avery's slowly repeated serial number with swift stabs of his index finger. A few seconds later, Avery's service record appeared on the pad. The lieutenant's eyes widened as a long string of meritorious citations and battlefield commendations cascaded down the monochromatic screen. Orion, Kaleidoscope, Tanglewood, Trebuchet, dozens of programs and operations, most of which Downs had never even heard of. Attached to Avery's file was a priority message from FleetCom, the Navy and Marine Corps headquarters on Reach. If you're AWOL, no one seems to mind. Down placed his compad back into his briefcase. In fact, I'm pleased to inform you that your request for transfer has been approved. For a moment, Avery's tired eyes flashed with suspicion. He hadn't requested a transfer, but in his current groggy state, anything sounded better than being shipped back to Epsilon Eridanus. His eyes darkened once more. Where? Didn't say. As long as it's quiet, Avery muttered. He let his head fall back against the recruitment center door, right between the legs of a Marine in full battle dress on a poster taped to the inside of the door that read, Stand, Fight, Serve. Avery's closed his eyes. What? Hey, Downs said gruffly. Can't sleep here, Marine. But Avery was already snoring. The lieutenant grimaced, hefted one of Avery's arms over his shoulder, and carried him to the back seat of his sedan. As Downs pulled out the mall's parking lot into thick noontime traffic, he wondered if catching a single AWOL war hero was as good as booking 5 raw recruits. If it would be enough to keep his CEO happy. Great Lakes Spaceport, he barked at his sedan. Quickest route. As a holographic map materialized on the inner surface of the sedan's curved windshield, Downs shook his head. If only I could be so lucky. Chapter 3. Damn, that was a long one. Poor Johnson is down on his luck, man. His aunt died. Got drunk as shit and nearly killed a guy. Based. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you liked this one. Please like, comment, subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.